the filmmakers, and the creepy town. When we first arrived in that little town, it felt like we had stumbled into a dream. The streets were postcard perfect, lined with cobblestones and surrounded by misty, rolling hills. I remember thinking it would add a magical touch to the film we were working on. The locals didn't seem thrilled to see us, though. A few of them stood in the doorways of their houses, watching as we unloaded our gear from the van. No smiles, no greetings, just this blank, heavy stare. At first, we joked about it, saying they probably weren't used to outsiders. But looking back, I think the way they watched us, like we didn't belong, should have been our first warning. Things started getting weird almost immediately. We were scouting locations that morning when we came across this old church on a hill. It was perfect for one of the scenes we wanted to shoot, but as we were setting up the camera, an elderly man appeared out of nowhere. He didn't say a word, just stood there, leaning on his cane, glaring at us with these pale, almost colorless eyes. When our director, Anna, walked up to ask if we had permission to film there, he turned his back and started walking away. But then, he stopped and muttered something under his breath. I couldn't hear it clearly, but it sounded like, "You don't belong here." I shrugged it off at the time, but the whole crew was on edge after that. We decided to move on to a different location, trying to shake off the strange encounter, but the atmosphere just kept getting heavier. By midday, the air felt oppressively still. No wind, no birds, nothing. It was like the whole town had gone mute. Even the streets seemed deserted, which was strange because earlier, we'd seen people milling around. We set up near a small bridge for another scene, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. At one point, I turned around quickly, and I swear I saw a figure duck behind a building. I told the others, but they just laughed it off, saying I was spooking myself. I wanted to believe that, but something about the way the shadows moved around that place didn't feel right. The breaking point came late that afternoon when we returned to the inn where we were staying. It wasn't a big place, just 6 rooms and a little lobby where the owner usually sat, knitting or reading a magazine. But when we walked in, she was just sitting there, staring straight ahead like she was in some kind of trance. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she didn't even blink when we said hello. Anna tried to get her attention, but she didn't react until Anna lightly touched her shoulder. That's when she snapped her head toward us, her eyes wide and furious, and hissed, "You should leave now." Her voice didn't sound human. It was deep, almost guttural, and it made my stomach turn. None of us knew what to say, and for a moment, we all just stood there frozen. Then she got up and walked out the front door, leaving us completely alone. After she left, the silence in the inn felt unbearable. None of us spoke for a while. We just stood there, staring at the empty doorway like she might come back any second. Eventually, Anna broke the tension, saying we should pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Everyone agreed, even though we hadn't finished shooting. But when we went up to our rooms to start packing, that's when things got worse. My room was at the end of the hallway, and as I opened the door, I froze. Everything had been rearranged. The bed was shoved into the corner, my suitcase was dumped out, and all my clothes were scattered across the floor. The worst part? Someone had scratched deep gouges into the walls. They weren't words, just jagged, chaotic lines that crisscrossed over each other like something out of a nightmare. I ran back to the others, my heart pounding, but before I could say anything, Sam, our sound guy, burst out of his room looking pale as a ghost. He said he'd been packing when he heard someone whisper his name. At first, he thought it was one of us messing around, but when he turned around, there was no one there. He swore the voice was right next to his ear. That was enough for me. I told everyone we needed to leave now, even if it meant driving through the night. But as we grabbed our gear and hurried downstairs, we noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every single window in the inn had been covered from the outside with newspapers. Thick, yellowed pages plastered across the glass, blocking out the fading daylight. We didn't waste any more time after that. We grabbed what we could carry and bolted for the van. The streets outside were darker than they should have been, like the light was being swallowed by the town itself. As we piled into the van, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched again. I glanced up at the windows of the surrounding buildings, and sure enough, I saw faces. Dozens of them, barely visible behind curtains and cracked glass, all staring down at us. None of them moved. Not a single twitch or blink. It was like they weren't people but mannequins propped up to observe us. I screamed at Anna to start the van, and when the engine finally roared to life, it felt like I could breathe again. But as we sped out of town, something darted across the road ahead of us, forcing Anna to slam on the brakes. It was the same old man from earlier, the one with the pale eyes. He was standing dead center in the road, illuminated by our headlights. His cane was gone, and he was hunched over, his arms hanging limply at his sides. For a moment, none of us moved. Then, slowly, he started walking toward the van. His steps were unsteady, almost robotic, but he was getting closer and closer. Anna fumbled with the gear shift, trying to reverse, but the van suddenly stalled. The man was only a few feet away now, and I could see his mouth moving, though no sound was coming out. I don't know what possessed Sam to do it, but he leaned on the horn, the loud blare echoing through the silent town. The man froze, then turned his head sharply toward the sound. That's when we saw them, the other townspeople, spilling out of their houses and into the street. The townspeople moved like a swarm, slow but deliberate, surrounding the van in an eerie, coordinated way. There were no shouts, no angry voices, just the sound of their shuffling feet and the occasional rustle of clothing. Someone in the back seat started crying softly, and I couldn't blame them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the door handle. Anna was frantically trying to restart the engine, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The old man, though, was still standing in front of the van, staring straight at us with those awful pale eyes. I swear, for a moment, I thought he was going to crawl onto the hood like some kind of animal. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The old man stepped back, his gaze still locked on us, and the rest of the townspeople froze in place. It was like someone had hit pause on a movie. Anna finally got the engine to turn over, and without a word, she slammed on the gas. The van lurched forward, scattering the townspeople as we tore down the road. I looked out the back window as we left, and they were just standing there, watching us go. None of them tried to follow. None of them even moved. They just stood in the middle of the street, getting smaller and smaller as we sped away, until the town itself disappeared into the darkness behind us. We drove for hours, not saying a word to each other. The silence in the van was thick, but it was better than talking about what had just happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale faces staring at us from the windows, or the old man shuffling toward the van. It didn't feel real, and yet my chest was tight, like I couldn't fully breathe. When we finally reached a bigger town with a motel, Anna pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. Nobody moved for a long time. Finally, Sam broke the silence, saying, "We can't go back there. Ever." We all nodded, too drained and terrified to argue. The weirdest part? The next morning, when we tried to explain what happened to the local police, they looked at us like we were insane. They said no such town existed in that area. At first, I thought they were messing with us, but they were serious. They even pulled out a map, and sure enough, there was nothing there, just miles of forest and empty roads. Anna wanted to drop it, but I couldn't. I needed to know if we had imagined it, or if we'd somehow ended up in a place we weren't supposed to find. But no matter how much I searched online or tried to retrace our route, I couldn't find any trace of that town. It's like it vanished the moment we left. To this day, I have no idea what we stumbled into, but I know one thing: it didn't want us there. The Haunted Tour and Cherry Crest. Back in 2017, my band, Hollow Pines, was grinding through a small regional tour. We were playing dive bars and college towns, trying to build a name for ourselves. It wasn't glamorous. Our tour bus was a beat-up white van, and we'd crash on couches or in cheap motels whenever we could. That summer, we were somewhere in western Pennsylvania, driving to our next gig in Allentown, when Jake, our bassist, suggested a shortcut. His phone showed a little side road that cut through a valley and shaved an hour off the drive. We were all tired and running low on cash, so we didn't think twice about it. That's how we found Cherry Crest. The valley road started off normal enough, winding through thick forests, with a view of rolling hills that stretched forever. But as we descended, things started feeling off. The air got heavier, like the kind of pressure before a storm, but the sky was clear. Then we saw it. Cherry Crest. It was like we'd driven straight into a postcard from the 1950s. The streets were lined with pastel-colored storefronts, and every car looked fresh off the assembly line. Big chrome Cadillacs and Buicks, not a scratch or speck of dirt on them. We rolled into town slowly, the van's tires crunching on the eerily clean pavement. At first, I thought it was some kind of movie set, but the people, man, they were the weirdest part. As we rolled down Main Street, every head turned to watch us. The people looked normal, I guess, but too polished. Men in neatly pressed suits, women in dresses with patterns straight out of a vintage catalog. Even the kids playing with hula hoops and jump ropes on the sidewalk seemed oddly perfect, like they'd been placed there for effect. But it wasn't just their appearance that got to me, it was how they stared. No smiles, no waves. Just wide, glassy eyes following the van as we passed, like they were trying to memorize us. Jake cracked a joke about feeling like we were in the Twilight Zone, but no one laughed. We decided to stop and check things out, mostly because we were low on gas, and none of us wanted to risk breaking down in the middle of nowhere. The gas station was an old-school place with a hand-painted sign reading, Wilson's Filling Station. When we pulled up, a man in a blue jumpsuit walked out, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall, with silver hair combed so neatly it looked like it had been glued in place. His face was lined, but his eyes were sharp and unsettling, like he could see straight through you. "Afternoon," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, like every word mattered. He didn't ask where we were headed or make small talk, just filled up the tank and gave us the total. But as I handed him a crumpled 20, he grabbed my wrist, firm but not rough, and said quietly, "You don't belong here." I pulled my arm back quickly, laughing nervously like it was some kind of joke, but the look in his eyes wasn't playful. Thanks," I mumbled, slipping back into the van. Jake, sitting shotgun, leaned out to ask about food in the area. The man hesitated, his hand gripping the pump a little too tightly. "Diner's down the street," he said finally, nodding toward a squat building with a gleaming chrome exterior. "But don't linger." His tone had shifted, no longer slow and deliberate, but clipped, like he couldn't wait for us to leave. We parked near the diner, and the weirdness of Cherry Crest only deepened. The smell of fresh-cut grass hung in the air, but there wasn't a single lawn in sight. Every store window displayed perfect mannequins in outdated clothes, but inside, the shelves were bare, like the stores were hollow facades. A couple walked by hand in hand, and as we passed, I caught a snippet of their conversation. Something about a new arrival. They stopped talking as soon as they noticed us, their smiles fading instantly. It wasn't like they were annoyed. It felt more like they were scared. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was no less unsettling. The place was spotless. Every chrome surface gleamed, and the black and white checkered floor looked freshly waxed. A jukebox in the corner played a soft, crackling tune that sounded vaguely familiar, but just wrong, like it was being played in reverse. The waitress behind the counter greeted us with a rehearsed smile, her bright red lipstick perfectly intact, not a smudge in sight. "What can I get you folks?" she asked, her voice high and melodic, like she'd stepped out of a 1950s sitcom. We ordered burgers and coffee, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching us, even as she busied herself behind the counter. When our food came, it looked almost too perfect. Thick, juicy patties with crisp lettuce and neatly buttered buns. But the first bite made my stomach turn. It wasn't spoiled or anything, but it tasted empty, like chewing on air with a faint hint of meat. Jake nudged me under the table, and when I looked up, I realized none of us were really eating. The tension was suffocating. Then, the bell above the door jingled, and in walked a man in a dark suit and a fedora. Every single person in the diner froze. The man in the suit walked with a deliberate, almost mechanical stride, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He stopped just inside the door, removed his hat, and scanned the room. His face was unsettling, sharp features, pale skin, and eyes so dark they looked like black holes. He didn't acknowledge us, but the waitress stiffened, clutching her order pad like it might shield her. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, like the rumble of distant thunder. No one answered. He lingered for a moment, then turned and walked back out without another word. As soon as the door closed, the diner sprang back to life, like someone had hit play on a paused scene. The waitress resumed pouring coffee, and the other customers started chatting in hushed tones. But something had changed. Now, they wouldn't even glance in our direction. "We need to leave," our drummer, Maddie, whispered, her voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. We paid the bill and bolted back to the van, the entire town seeming to watch us as we left. When we hit the edge of Cherry Crest, the heaviness in the air lifted so suddenly it felt like breaking through the surface of deep water. We drove in silence for a while, the van rattling along the winding road as we climbed out of the valley. None of us could find the words to explain what had just happened. Maddie was the first to break the silence. "Did anyone else notice how quiet it was back there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. No birds, no wind. Even the cars didn't make a sound. He was right. Thinking back, the pristine cars hadn't moved an inch the entire time we were in Cherry Crest. They just sat there, perfectly still, like props on a stage. When we reached the next town, it was like stepping back into reality. The gas station had a weathered awning, the diner looked run down, and the people were normal, messy, distracted, alive. We filled up the van again and debated whether we should talk about what happened. Maddie insisted we let it go, but Jake, ever the skeptic, wanted to prove it wasn't just in our heads. "Let's go back tomorrow," he said, grinning like it was all some big adventure. I wasn't sure, but a part of me wanted answers. Against my better judgment, we agreed to check it out again the next day. The next morning, we set out early, retracing our route with Jake navigating from his phone. It felt different this time. No heavy air, no ominous stillness. The valley road seemed brighter, more ordinary, like any other back road we'd driven 100 times. But when we reached the spot where Cherry Crest should have been, it wasn't there. Instead, we found a regular small town, bustling with life. The pastel storefronts had been replaced with weathered brick buildings, and the old cars were gone, replaced by pickups and sedans with rusted bumpers. It was like Cherry Crest had been wiped off the map. We parked and wandered through the streets, searching for anything that could confirm what we'd seen the day before. Nothing matched, not the diner, the gas station, or even the layout of the streets. Maddie kept muttering under her breath, clearly shaken. Jake, on the other hand, was determined to find something. He flagged down a man unloading crates outside a general store and asked about Cherry Crest. The guy gave him a confused look. "Never heard of it," he said, shaking his head. "You sure you're in the right place?" The doubt in his voice made my stomach sink. Maybe we really had imagined it. As we walked back to the van, the weight of disappointment, and maybe relief, started settling in. Maddie kept saying it was probably some collective stress-induced hallucination, and Jake was unusually quiet, his face scrunched in frustration. I didn't know what to believe. But just as I opened the van door, something caught my eye. Tucked into the windshield wiper was a small piece of paper, folded neatly. My pulse quickened as I grabbed it, unfolding it with shaky hands. The note was written in perfect, looping handwriting. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze, staring at the words. "What is it?" Jake asked, leaning over to look. When I showed him, his face went pale. "This is a joke, right?" Maddie's voice cracked as she snatched the note from my hand, but she had no explanation either. The weirdest part? The paper smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, the same smell that had lingered in Cherry Crest. We didn't stick around to ask questions. Without another word, we piled into the van and got out of there, leaving the valley behind for good. For weeks after, Cherry Crest haunted us. Not just the memory of the town, but the strange little anomalies that seemed to follow. Maddie swore she kept hearing the crackling jukebox tune in the quiet moments before falling asleep. Jake started noticing vintage cars parked near his apartment, always pristine, always empty. At first, I thought they were just spooked, their minds playing tricks on them. But then one night, while unloading gear after a show, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Parked at the far end of the lot was a sleek, cherry red Cadillac, its chrome gleaming under the streetlights. It looked exactly like one of the cars we'd seen in Cherry Crest, down to the white wall tires and the spotless license plate. I walked closer, my heart pounding, hoping to find some kind of explanation. But as I approached, the air grew thick, heavy, just like it had in the valley. Then I saw it, a figure in the driver's seat, perfectly still, watching me with dark, glassy eyes. I blinked, and the car was gone. Just like that. To this day, none of us can explain what happened. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes, when we're on the road and pass a quiet little town, we get that same uneasy feeling. Like somewhere out there, Cherry Crest is still waiting for us. Or worse, it never really let us leave. The corruption in the small town. When I first moved to Maywood, it seemed like the perfect place to start over. After my divorce, I needed a clean slate, and the quiet charm of a small town felt like just what the doctor ordered. The locals were friendly enough, smiling faces at the diner, a wave from the mailman every morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. People were polite, sure, but they kept their distance. They answered questions with vague nods and changed the subject if you pried too much. I figured they just weren't used to outsiders, so I didn't think much of it at first. That changed after the elections. A new group of officials swept into power, led by a man named Garrett Leland. The kind of guy who could charm a room but left you feeling like you needed to wash your hands after shaking hands. Things started small. New curfew rules that nobody seemed to question. Small businesses quietly closing without explanation, and a noticeable uptick in police presence. It wasn't long before the police were everywhere, patrolling streets where there was no crime, pulling people over for the smallest infractions, and more unsettlingly, showing up unannounced at people's homes. The town that once felt like a peaceful escape began to feel like a pressure cooker, and I could feel the heat rising every day. The tension in town was palpable, but what really opened my eyes was meeting Paul Davison. Paul had lived in Maywood his whole life and wasn't the type to keep quiet about things. He owned the only hardware store in town and had a reputation for being outspoken, especially about the new administration. "They're squeezing us dry," he told me one afternoon when I stopped by for some tools. "Garrett and his cronies are nothing but crooks." I wasn't sure what to say. Hearing someone talk like that felt dangerous. He must have seen the worry on my face because he added, "Don't let them scare you. That's what they want." I started noticing things after that conversation. People whispered in corners, avoided eye contact with the police, and seemed to shuffle through their days with a kind of quiet dread. Paul's warnings didn't feel like paranoia anymore. Then came the incident with his dog, Rufus. Rufus was this big, goofy lab that everyone in town loved. One evening, Paul's shop was broken into, and the next morning, Rufus was found dead in his yard, poisoned. It was a brutal message, clear as day, and everyone knew it. Paul was heartbroken. "They think they can silence me with this," he said, his voice shaking, "but I won't stop." Paul didn't stop, but things got worse for him, and the rest of us. A few days after Rufus's death, someone spray-painted "Traitor" across the front of his hardware store. When he tried to report it, the police just shrugged, like it wasn't their problem. That was when I realized the police weren't just complicit, they were part of it. They didn't protect the people of Maywood, they protected Garrett and his crew. I started hearing stories about people being fined for ridiculous reasons, or even dragged out of their homes in the middle of the night. No one knew where they were taken, and no one dared to ask. One night, I was walking home from the diner when I saw two officers pulling a man out of his car near the edge of town. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the man was pleading, his hands up, trying to explain something. One of the officers hit him hard across the face, and he crumpled to the ground. I ducked behind a parked truck and watched as they loaded him into their cruiser and drove off. My stomach turned as I realized that I was too afraid to intervene. That's what Maywood had done to me. It made fear feel normal, like survival depended on staying silent. The next morning, Paul's store didn't open. I walked by and saw the windows boarded up, the closed sign hanging crookedly on the door. Word spread quickly. Paul had been arrested. The official story was something about unpaid taxes, but everyone knew it was retaliation. I asked around, but nobody could tell me where they'd taken him. People just shook their heads or muttered, "Best to stay out of it." It hit me then, we were all trapped. Nobody in Maywood was willing to stand up anymore, not after what happened to Paul, and definitely not after Rufus. That night, I sat on my porch, staring out at the empty street. It was so quiet you could hear the wind rustling through the trees, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm before a storm. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang from the direction of Paul's shop, followed by the screech of tires. By the time I got there, the whole place was engulfed in flames. The fire department didn't even show up until it was too late. Everyone knew it was arson, but no one said a word. The next day, Garrett Leland was on the local news, calling it a tragic accident. His smug smile said otherwise. After Paul's arrest and the fire, it felt like the town was suffocating. People stopped meeting in public, stopped chatting over coffee at the diner. Even the Sunday farmers market disappeared. It was like the life had been sucked out of Maywood. I started keeping to myself too, avoiding eye contact with anyone in uniform and double-checking that my doors were locked every night. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, I'd see the same black SUV parked near my street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of someone standing at the edge of my yard, only for them to disappear when I turned the lights on. Then, one evening, I heard a knock at my door. Not a polite knock, loud, deliberate, and unnervingly slow. My heart dropped. Through the peephole, I saw two officers standing there, their faces blank, almost bored. "We just want to ask you a few questions," one of them said, his voice muffled through the door. I froze, torn between opening it and pretending I wasn't home. They knocked again, harder this time, and I knew I didn't have a choice. As I opened the door, I forced a weak smile and asked what this was about. They didn't answer. Instead, one of them stepped inside without asking, his boots leaving muddy prints on my rug. The taller officer walked in like he owned the place, scanning my living room with a slow, deliberate gaze. "Mind if we sit?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. I gestured awkwardly toward the couch, and they both sat, their presence suffocating the small space. The shorter one finally spoke. "We've noticed you've been asking questions," he said, his tone casual but laced with warning. My throat felt dry, and I stammered, "I haven't done anything. I just..." I mind my own business. The taller one smirked, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. That's good. That's smart. You keep it that way. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine like he was daring me to say something. When I didn't, he nodded toward the door. We'll see ourselves out. As they left, the shorter one stopped in the doorway and added, Nice place you've got here. Be a shame if something happened to it. The door clicked shut, and I stood there, frozen. They hadn't asked me a single real question. It wasn't about information. It was about making sure I understood who was in charge. After that night, I stopped sleeping properly. Every creak in the house, every passing car, set my nerves on edge. I thought about leaving town, but something told me they wouldn't let me go so easily. Maywood felt like a trap, and no matter how quiet I tried to be, I could feel the walls closing in. The last straw came a week later when I found a dead bird on my porch. A crow, its wings twisted and broken. Tied to its leg was a note that simply read, Don't forget, we're watching. I couldn't take it anymore. That note was the final push I needed to start packing. I didn't care where I went. I just knew I had to leave Maywood. But as I was loading the last of my things into the car, I noticed a patrol car parked down the street. Its headlights off, but its silhouette unmistakable. My stomach churned. They knew. They always knew. My heart was racing as I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life, but before I could shift into gear, the patrol car's lights flicked on, bathing the street in red and blue. 2 officers stepped out, one of them holding a flashlight that he pointed directly at my face. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. Going somewhere, he asked, his voice casual but with that same underlying menace. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Just visiting family, I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. He smirked. Drive safe, he said, stepping back, but something in his tone told me that he'd be watching. I drove off, my chest tight with panic, and didn't stop until I was miles outside of town. I never went back to Maywood. Even now, years later, I don't talk about it much. I don't know what happened to Paul or if the people in that town ever found a way to fight back. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that place. Its quiet streets, the sound of boots on my porch, and that dead crow with its twisted wings. The worst part? Maywood wasn't just a town. It was a warning, a reminder of what happens when good people are too afraid to stand up. And no matter how far I've run, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching.